I love Elden Ring, so please don't yell at me. What I'm about to say is a sincere look at the game and is not a video to say why you shouldn't like it. Something I put in over 100 hours, something is my game of the year so far, something I love this game, so please don't yell at me. So I finished Elden Ring and what can I say? I loved it. It has its problems, and while its lows were probably lower and longer than any other Souls Sekiro-born game for me, its highs were just about as high as any game can get. And who can complain about that? But I couldn't help but feel a little crestfallen by the end of it, because what I started to realize is it signals the end of an era. There's no question that FromSoft is going to make Elden Ring its default type game going forward now, and while I think a good portion of folks agree that the game comes up short in areas, I've noticed that the larger conversation isn't capturing the key issue for why that is for me. Even though people are acknowledging that there's something about the open world that makes the experience feel wrong, I'm not sure what's being discussed is an accurate representation of what's different. And that's partly due to the fact that the language in video game criticism is so messy right now. Oh, that's right. This is another obsessive look at what's wrong with language in video game criticism. And by the end of this, we'll hopefully be able to agree not necessarily what's wrong with Elden Ring, but at the very least, why many of us are seemingly feeling the same dissatisfaction with its change in direction. And it's worth noting, I know traditional Souls games are likely never coming back, and no amount of internet complaining is going to change that. Anyway, so I'm going to complain on the internet now. And this is going to require an examination of what Elden Ring is, what its predecessors are, and where we're going to start exploring genre in video games. As it is, it seems like gameplay genres are primarily based on marketing decisions to attract already existing fan bases, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Personally, I know I need to know what a game genre is before I buy it, add it to my growing Steam list of unplayed games, and then never play it, because I'm a huge piece of shit and everyone has their preferred genres, whether it be JRPGs, CRPGs, first-person shooters, third-person shooters, roguelikes, roguelites, racing, open-world games, simulators, dopamine extractors.
Whoa, that's good dopamine!
RTS, sports, or whatever else you can think of. It's paramount we know what a game's game genre is before we buy it to know if we'll like it. In other words, the game genre affects the marketability of the game, so it's not wrong for publishers to have this mentality when deciding what kind of game they're going to make next. People like shooters now? Cool, make a ton of shooters. People like motion controls now? Let's make our own. People like open world games now? Everything should be an open world game. But I think something's missing from this discussion when publishers seemingly make games largely or even solely based on this reason. Because video games are in fact unique from other mediums in that they have two genres. There's the narrative genre, and then there's the gameplay genre. Depending on who you ask, the definitions for these can be simplified in different ways, but my favorite explanation comes from Ernest Adams, who says the narrative genre describes the content, and the gameplay genre describes the challenge. Now, this isn't all that hard to recognize, and once it's articulated like this, it becomes a no-duh kind of identification. The narrative genre of Halo, i.e. its content, falls into the science fiction genre, and the gameplay genre, i.e. its challenges, falls into the first-person shooter genre, which requires we aim properly in a 3D space from the character's point of view when pulling the trigger. Again, nothing too exciting here. But as I always like to discuss, and the reason that I bring it up is to talk about how the gameplay and narrative can work together. Because when the gameplay and narrative work together, games can offer a cathartic experience, even when we're talking about something as basic as genres. To better understand what I mean by this, let's look at a series that hasn't just changed its gameplay genre over the years, it's changed its narrative genre as well. The Resident Evil series. Because I want to talk about how these decisions to change the narrative genre, along with the gameplay genre, affect the emotion of the game. The original game tells a traditional gothic horror story about experiments and a virus run amok, but it doesn't just tell its story through its diary entries, secret underground laboratories, and cutscenes. It's also told through the gameplay and what we're talking about here, the gameplay genre. Because this game is technically a third-person shooter, and that means it's able to show the character through Hitchcockian camera angles and distances. That translates to the menacing sense that players are being watched. It's a sense of paranoia that creeps into your consciousness long after you've turned off the game. What's more is, the original game is one that helped shape its gameplay genre of survival horror, a genre that's meant to make players feel unprepared for the horrors of the game. In Resident Evil's case, the player has ammunition and guns, but they think twice before using these resources since there's a looming sense that they can run out of these items at a time they need it most. It gives players a sense of self-doubt in all of their combat choices, and they never feel quite prepared for what's around the next corner. The result is a potent emotion that has players considering the horror of the narrative through the horrors of the gameplay, thinking of this concept in terms of a formula, and it becomes a little more firm. Start with the narrative genre that offers a fairly well-told horror story. Amplify it with the emotion provided by the gameplay genre, where players feel their anxiety increase as each bullet in their supply decreases, as well as a sense of paranoia from the camera, and the game spits out a tangible emotion, in this case, fear and paranoia. So, mission accomplished here. The game is as scary as it is, not only because the narrative works, but because the gameplay reinforces it. Moving on to Resident Evil 4, and we see a much different game. Gone are the creepy monsters that waited off camera in tight corners. Now we have a Halloween town of monsters that resemble the lineup of what you'd see in a haunted house. Gone are the characters who acknowledge their predicament and are working towards escaping this nightmare.
Richard, what the hell happened to you? Chris, this place. Get your team out of here. Demons everywhere.
Now we have a character who says James Bond-like quips when mouthing off to the bad guy.
So maybe you have 9 lives, but it doesn't matter now, Mr. Kennedy. I've sent my right hand to dispose of you.
Your right hand comes off?
And while the narrative horror seems to now be tongue-in-cheek or even just plain stupid at times, the game mechanics offer much more power to players. While this is still a third-person shooter, this is now an action third-person shooter. Players now control the camera, and with that, they have the freedom to do more damage. Not only are there bonus points for shooting well, there's interactive environments so we can gain dominance over these slow-moving monsters. Lastly, while there are some elements of survival horror here, it's largely removed. Whether it be upgrading weapons, upgrading your storage space, using grenades with huge blast zones and damage, luring enemies into traps, or literally suplexing enemies via button prompt, the game is doing everything it can to make players feel empowered. And this combination of the gameplay and narrative genres becoming closer to action with horror aesthetics makes for a game that's a ton of fun, but it's not very scary. And as we all know, Resident Evil 7 takes us back to its survival horror roots that made this series as successful as it is. Just about everything is back from the original game to evoke an actual sense of horror that you got from the gameplay and narrative synergizing like it did in the original game, except for the third-person camera. Now we have a first-person camera, and with that, the horror is that much more immediate. Gone is the avatar that stood between players and the dangers of this world. Now what we see is what our character sees. And more than that, we now have a constrained screen space with which to see enemies. The whole thing makes it so there's a sense of claustrophobia as we navigate these tight spaces and hear threatening noises while knowing it's up to us and only us to clear these threats as they arise. This is all to say, changing the gameplay genre creates a different kind of horror experience. While we no longer have paranoia of being watched like we had in the original game, we now have a sense of claustrophobia, meaning the trade-off still creates emotion that complements the narrative genre. Looking at this series, we get a good understanding of how interwoven the gameplay and narrative genres are to the emotion the game is trying to convey. It's a game series that understands that its narrative isn't just an excuse for the gameplay to exist, and the gameplay genre doesn't exist simply to make it more attractive to the market. Instead, it understands the narrative is a tool, just like the gameplay is a tool, and they both accomplish the same goal. They both work to influence players' emotions. And this really is what I'm getting at, because the gameplay genre of a game can offer all sorts of emotion to amplify the story's content. And what I want to look at now is how my favorite gameplay genre, Metroidvanias, offer some of my favorite titles out there, but only when the genre keeps in mind what we just learned about when it comes to the gameplay and narrative genres, amplifying the other's emotion. So allow me to confess something that I've only said in passing on my Twitch streams. I love Metroidvanias. They're easily some of my favorite games by a large margin. But I need to offer a caveat. I hate Metroidvanias. It has some of the most banal titles I've ever forced myself to play. And there's something worth discussing in the fact that my experience with Metroidvanias is so hit and miss, because I think I finally figured out why that is. And it has to do with what we were just talking about. Some games are Metroidvanias because they complement the story, and some games are Metroidvanias because there's a decent sized audience with appetites for them, and little more thought put into them than that. And this really is my litmus test for what makes a good Metroidvania, whether they understand how important the gameplay mechanics that come with the genre are in influencing players' emotions. To better understand what I'm getting at, let's quickly look more in depth into Metroidvanias, their mechanics and how those mechanics translate into emotion, and how that emotion helps communicate the goals of the story. And I don't want to spend too much time on what Metroidvanias are, because largely we all have a general idea. You got your interconnected maps that are designed to be mazes, you got your backtracking, you got your forks in the road with nothing but your intuition to tell you which way to go, you have your non-linear progress, you have your power-ups and keys that allow you further traversal to unexplored parts of the map, you got your enemies that respawn when activating arbitrary switches, you got your save points, you got your bosses, and so on. Altogether and done correctly, these design concepts lead to a gameplay loop with tangible emotion. And I want to focus on what I think is the most important part of the gameplay loop in a Metroidvania, exploration. Because I think it's tempting to think that this is a simple concept. After all, we know what exploration is. You're completing areas that you haven't yet experienced that are still mysterious. But I want to look in depth into exploration, going beyond just the colloquial definition and look at it as a game mechanic. Because I think the difference identifies the reason this game genre struggles with consistency as much as it does. My definition of exploration as a game mechanic is twofold. Exploration first has to do with the player's own choices determining where they go next, meaning the game has to make it clear that players are making choices in these moments, and additionally, there should be tangible risk associated with that choice. Let's take a recent example of the genre that's also an ideal example of this. Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. This is a game with some of the most complicated maps I've ever seen, meaning it's full of choices for players to make, but they aren't just cramped hallways. Exploring these paths will take you to huge vistas that, if studied carefully, you can recognize when you're on different parts of the map to help orient yourself. There are optional paths that lead to more optional paths, and paths that players might only discover if they're looking carefully. It challenges players to divine where the crit path is and where the optional rewards are. And depending on what they choose, they'll find strong enemies, platforming challenges, shortcuts, and of course, rewards. This is to say, it takes some poking and prodding that comes entirely from the player's own curiosity. And as they poke and prod, they're fully aware that at any time, they can walk down a path that they can't yet handle. Or they can, but their controller's being really weird right now. In other words, this is the risk. And they're tempted to try new paths because they can receive rewards that makes this very exploration I'm describing less risky. In other words, this is the player's choice in how they will engage with the map. What I'm trying to say is, exploration is easier said than done. A game really does need to make sure it's following both these rules to make exploration qualify as a game mechanic and thus become a part of the game genre's challenges. But what I think is most important to what I'm describing here, and is unfortunately easy to overlook, is how exploration differs from completion. To see completion in action, we no longer have the two elements I said was so important to exploration. To better understand what I mean, let's take an obvious example from the open world game Horizon Forbidden West. Sure, players can survey the land where they don't yet know what lies ahead, and it's tempting to call that exploration. But the primary way in which players decide to interact with this world is through quests, and more importantly, quest markers, as this is where the bulk of their experience points or rewards comes from. With these mechanics, players aren't making carefully considered decisions on their own as they navigate an unmapped region, nor do they feel as though there's any real risk for going towards a quest marker. It's just something they'll do now because their level matches the level in the quest description. And if it's too high for them now, they'll do it later. Meaning, not only is there almost no decision making involved, there's almost no risk involved either. It's just an option for them to do something should they choose to do it. This is the difference between completion and exploration. Which is to say, exploration is no small thing. When it's done right, it won't make us feel as though we're completing the game, but rather our decisions and skill level are integral to our success. And again, this confusion of exploration and completion is done all the time in modern Metroidvanias, and it makes them fall flat. It can come in the form of linear design with backtracking to obfuscate the linearity, autosave mechanics that only trigger on the crit path, thereby making advancement in the game feel like there's a progress ratchet, so you know you're going in the right direction, meaning the game has unintentionally eliminated decision making. Procedurally generated maps that make our choices feel random and therefore we don't think twice about it, or it can be literal lines on the map outlining the path we're supposed to take. Developer choices like these might seem benign or even beneficial for players, but they're ultimately what vitiates emotion. Now players simply rely on the game's larger systems to guide them. And when the game's systems are guiding players more than their own instincts or choices, exploration is forfeited from the equation, and players are simply completing the game. Contrast this with Metroidvanias that understand how important exploration is in communicating emotion, and it's an entirely different ballgame. Something like Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. Here we have very few systems to exploit, and if you crank up the difficulty to the highest, there's serious risk for one of the many choices you make. And again, this creates tangible emotion. Feeling stressed about how much HP I have left and fatigued about how long it's been since I last encountered a save point is some of the most tense experiences I've had in gaming, because if I died, I would have to start all over and potentially lose my experience if I don't reach at least as far as I made it this time. But on the other hand, once I do reach a save point after exploring, fighting, running low on health stims and force points, there's a tangible sense of relief. Now I can rest, replenish my health and health items, spend the experience I earned, and most importantly, save the progress I made getting here. Same goes for finding power-ups and force powers that attract me to explore not just the crit path, but all available paths, meaning there's a genuine sense of excitement that's a result of my exploration that has nothing to do with me following quest markers, task lists, or a game's tell. Everywhere I go because I have a goal in mind when making that choice. And every choice I make is coded in risk. And this is the kind of tangible emotion I'm talking about. There's a feeling of isolation and excitement, tension and reward, self-doubt and relief that comes along with the gameplay genre when using exploration, not completion, as a mechanic. And the reason I'm going as in-depth as I am about what emotion Metroidvanias are capable of communicating is because the sooner this is understood, the sooner games can pair these emotions with the stories they want to tell. Because when the narrative genre is communicating the same thing, you get an emotionally potent game. An example I can think of off the top of the dome is, Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. This is a story about the well-known empire that has now squashed any form of resistance. To communicate this, the opening shot is one that's likely familiar. It's a callback to the opening scenes from episodes 4, 5, and 6, except it's not. Instead of this being the introduction to a literal Star War, the game establishes that fight is long over. This isn't a story about a chosen one Jedi who will be taught the ways of the Force, and will go on to be so powerful that he's the only one who can overthrow the prevailing evil. It's instead a story about a Jedi who's turned his back on his training, who only now wants to live a normal life in the blind spots of the Empire. Because for the protagonist, Cal Kestis, he too realizes that this battle has already been fought and lost, and it's much too big for him to participate in it now. And so now he works an ordinary job, trying his best to blend in and leave his past behind him. However, once the character stumbles upon an old Jedi ship that's long been destroyed but not yet discovered.
Take a look at this. It's a Jedi fighter. What a score! It's a real scrapper's payday.
Cal carefully wipes the dust off it, revealing the Jedi Order symbol. And now Cal too will be discovered as a Jedi hiding in plain sight.
We seek a dangerous fugitive. This is no common anarchist, but a devotee of the treasonous Jedi Order.
And so too will he now renew his fight against the Empire. And with this opening scene, the game really does establish everything it needs to in order to set up the emotion of the story. The subversion of the epic space battles that opened other Star Wars stories establishes the fight, and the optimism to win it is long finished. The link between Cal and the Jedi ship establishes the battle continues as long as there are those to fight it, and the immensity of the Empire shows just how small a single dissenter is in comparison to it. Ultimately, this is one of the most powerful Star Wars stories I've experienced that establishes just what a force the Empire is. It's an unstoppable machine that grinds up anything in its path and targets anyone who values their individuality. And this is why we have the second sister as the villain who kills indiscriminately.
To the Empire, we're all just expendable.
Yes, you are.
But more importantly to the story, she used to be a Jedi like Cal before she abandoned her humanity and became an apparatus of this machine. And one losing their humanity seems to be a natural evolution for all who join the Jedi. And we know this because this is something that's explicitly stated.
You know, I was a Jedi. It'd be fun to bring you in. Watch you rock like the rest of us!
In this way, she's a foil to the main character, a character who represents individualism and humanity as he questions himself and whether or not he'll be able to maintain those values.
The Ninth Sister said something about becoming an Inquisitor like it's inevitable.
Because as is part of his character conflict in the game, he knows that at any time, he can take the same path as the second sister. And while he won't be able to solely stop the Empire, he will be able to disrupt some of its plans. It's not a story about gaining ultimate power. It's a story about balancing power through the power the Empire overlooks, the power of our humanity, even if we are dwarfed by comparison to it. This is why a Metroidvania's emotions works as well as it does in this context. This isn't supposed to be a story where the player feels as though if they helped enough NPCs with their wants and needs, they will be rewarded for it as a reflex, and they'll repeat this until they earn enough reward, experience, and money to defeat the final bad guy. Nor is this supposed to be a story where the player feels as though they can simply exploit the extra diegetic game systems in order to beeline it to and defeat the final boss. This is a story about a character who's constantly aware they can be destroyed or consumed by the Empire's power. And that's something we're aware of in almost every door we unlock and every path we decide to follow. In other words, we feel it through the gameplay. Now, for the record, while I've spent a lot of time talking about exploration, it's only a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition, to make a good Metroidvania. There's a lot more that goes into making this genre what it is, but what I really wanted to focus on was the gameplay genre's ability to make players feel emotion through its mechanics. Because just like we can see here, the gameplay genre is one of the most impactful choices developers can make, not just in marketing the game, but as a tool with which they can make players feel the impact of their stories. That's true for all kinds of different stories. It's true if you're telling a story about a Jedi Knight using whatever resources he can find to slow an Imperial machine, a bounty hunter exploring an alien planet that's entirely hostile to her, a knight exploring the ruins of a fallen kingdom, or a chosen undead who's to rekindle what's left of a flame in a dying land. Because that's correct, Dark Souls is a Metroidvania. So let's briefly talk about this.
When are they gonna get to the
Elden Ring.
Look, I'm sorry I have to do this as well, but unfortunately the language in this discussion has become so sloppy, I need to address this subject directly. So bear with me just a little longer because we're almost there. Again, there's a small section of the internet that wants to argue over whether Dark Souls actually qualifies as a Metroidvania. And look, I get it. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when a game does become this genre, when it shares attributes with so many other game genres. Is there a rigid set of criteria that says the game can only stick to the tools offered in Symphony of the Night? Or is it an immersion property that comes out of design principles that are more abstract than these specific tools? Unfortunately, this doesn't seem to be a conversation that the internet is yet equipped to handle, because the language is just too flimsy right now. For example, we all know the lore about Reddit mods. I believe the saying goes, the only time Reddit mods will have someone else's saliva touch their face is long after they're dead and their cats begin to eat it. And staying true to form, that's about what we see on the Metroidvania subreddit, where instead of offering reasoning behind why Dark Souls isn't a Metroidvania, the mods created a bot that will simply assert that it isn't every time it picks up on someone's comment saying otherwise. No need to have a conversation about it. The sweaty mods on Reddit have already spoken. But for those of us who aren't sweaty, lonely, and just impossibly sad, it's worth digging into this topic to actually have a thoughtful conversation about it. And I think I know why it's at least a little bit controversial. From what I can tell, it seems the comparison first came from the legendary Yahtzee in 2014, who said this.
I'd say the turning point was some ways in when I thought, maybe I'll try this boss again, or maybe I'll explore the 3 other areas that opened up after I strangled the sacred vest of Saint Bumnose. And then it hit me, that's Symphony of the Night thinking. And I love Symphony of the Night, but no non-2D games have captured the essence of Metroidvania, I'd argue, since Metroid Prime.
And I get why some people might see this as a flimsy comparison based on the language. After all, tons of games let you go to new areas in a different order if you run into difficulty spikes. This is true of Mega Man as is true of Skyrim. And while I agree with the Yahtzee here, I feel like this soft definition changes this from a clear criteria to an I know it when I see it kind of criteria. This leads to the attempted internet takedowns I'm talking about. Some of these arguments are silly on their face and have nothing more than arbitrary requirements. One such example I've heard is Dark Souls doesn't have any keys that unlock more than one door, and therefore it's not a Metroidvania. And that's of course not true because the Lord Vessel unlocks 3 doors, you're just not holding a key directly up to the fog wall. Checkmate, atheists. And the rest of the arguments seem to miss the forest for the trees. One argument demands that Metroidvanias have abilities in them that act as keys rather than being physical keys. Dark Souls only has physical keys and lacks the power-up keys, therefore it's not a Metroidvania. And while I'm sympathetic with this because I like getting new abilities that allow me to access new areas quite a lot, I don't think this argument appreciates the larger principle going on in Metroidvanias. Because the same principle is at work in Dark Souls as is at work in Super Metroid. After all, the reason it's so enjoyable to find new abilities that unlock new areas as opposed to finding random keys is because it's not only organic progression, this is progression that communicates. Players are opening up the world for themselves, rather than communicating the game is planning this on their behalf. And this has value. Just think about how the emotion changes if after beating a boss, a player finds a red key. The player will now remember that they saw some red doors earlier in the game. Now players feel as though they've completed enough of the game to allow them beyond a certain progress gate. The problem with this is it breaks the illusion the game is trying to create, because the game is outright telling you that this is the next step in the game. Now compare this with getting the grappling hook in Super Metroid. Players have to think about all the places they've seen in the game where they can now use this item. Once they do, they can now access this area that opens up even more of the game. Functionally, these two concepts are the same. They're both binary switches that allow players access to new parts of the game, but the difference is in the emotion they provide. With the physical key, players feel as though the world is a puzzle box that's meant to be opened, where one key is leveraged to gain another. A feeling that's amplified since the key is on the player's progress path. This is perceived as passive advancement. The game dictates where to go next. However, when they have progression through power-ups that allow them to act upon the world and overcome its challenges, players perceive this as active advancement. Players realize they might not be taking the route that this world had opened to its original inhabitants, but they brute forced their way by using this tool. In other words, while these are functionally identical, they're separated by what they communicate, and what they communicate is emotion. Because ultimately what players are understanding in the version where power-ups act like keys is they cannot rely on the larger game systems to tell them where to go, and so they feel stranded and alone. And the emotion captured in what I just described is the same kind of thing we see captured in Dark Souls. However, instead of a digital switch that gets turned from off to on when you find a new power-up, Dark Souls takes an analog approach. When starting out, you'll find there are plenty of regions on the map you can't yet visit, or else meet a swift death. These are the progress gates. But as you dial in higher stats for your character, upgrade your weapons, and find new spells and weapons, you're allowing yourself access to new regions of the map. You're still engaging with the game in the same way that you would in both Super Metroid and Dark Souls, and more importantly, you're getting the same kind of emotion as you would from the two different games. And what's more is, Dark Souls enhances this emotion, because even if you are more powerful after defeating the Belfry Gargoyles, you still don't know if you're ready to try the Catacombs, meaning the lack of clarity on where to go next is that much more potent than in Super Metroid, because Super Metroid still has the slight suggestion for where players should go next based on visual cues. This is all to say, this binary approach to allowing access to new areas is an arbitrary requirement. Dark Souls' analog approach communicates the exact same feeling of being stranded and alone, as well or better than other Metroidvanias. And the last argument that I'll bring up is one that I also think misses the forest for the trees and seems to misunderstand the larger principles going on in genres that we talked about. It's the idea that if we allow Dark Souls to be considered a Metroidvania, we also have to consider other 3D games, or pseudo-3D games, like Resident Evil, to be a Metroidvania. While it's very true that there's backtracking, keys to locked doors, exploration, and even save rooms that are removed from the dangers of the larger world, there's still something that makes this gameplay genre different from a Metroidvania that no amount of obtuseness can ignore. The fact that these are entirely different genres, in more than name only. Like we've already discussed, Resident Evil is a survival horror game. Ammo is rationed and you have to choose your targets carefully. What's more is, once you kill an enemy, with some exceptions, they're gone forever. Meaning you are incentivized to kill enemies if you want to navigate the hallway safely. But the other side of the coin is, engaging with that enemy means you risk losing finite resources. In other words, the evaluation changes from a risk-reward proposition to a severe penalty, less severe penalty proposition. And this happens with almost every enemy, because the bullets, herbs, and first aid spray, and even enemy encounters are meant to be reconsidered when engaging with this game. The result of this, again, is a scary game that's full of tension as players doubt and reconsider their combat choices. And because the risk evaluation is so high when engaging with these enemies, the game is able to maintain tension, even in areas players have already explored. And so players are often tasked with backtracking across the mansion several times over. And so when designing this game, the maps aren't nearly as large as you'd find in a Metroidvania, because there's tension if the game makes you backtrack, just as there's tension if the game has you encounter a new area. Now compare this to Dark Souls, and it's an entirely different game. You're never required to use finite resources for combat, and certainly never on an enemy-by-enemy basis like we saw with Resident Evil. Sure, you can run out of HP, and if you're a caster, you can run out of spells, but once you get to a bonfire, everything is replenished, including your healing items. In other words, this game is filled with short-term gambles, but unlike Resident Evil, that's creating a need to risk assess in every interaction you have with the numerous enemies. There's no long-term penalty that's making you evaluate if you will engage at all with them. And that's simply because there are no combat gambles that threaten to punish you until the end of the game. And that means players engage with this game in an entirely different way. Most enemies respawn at every bonfire, and so players have an infinite method to deal with these enemies. What's more is, players are highly incentivized to kill every enemy on their path, unless the enemies are too low level for players to worry about, or players have explored these areas already. And when players are killing most or every enemy without concern for long-term penalties, and on the contrary they're looking for long-term rewards, it means they're having a wholly different experience from survival horror. We might die in our attempts to reach the next save point. We might run out of spells too, but we aren't forced, nor do we risk being forced, to use rare items that we have no idea if or when will be replaced in order to reach the next save point. And so we engage with combat freely in the same way we do with any Metroidvania, which is to say, wholly different from how we engage with survival horror. But what's more is, this doesn't only affect how players interact with each game. The difference in gameplay genres affects everything about the game, including how it's designed. Because there isn't nearly as much tension and backtracking, this means the maps sprawl outwards, with branching paths that contain their own branching paths. In other words, these aren't arbitrary requirements I'm urging be considered. The distinction I'm addressing here is the distinction between core gameplay loops that influences everything right down to the map design. And this is no small thing, because the core gameplay loop is the main interaction players will have with each game. While the map ticks so many of the boxes we recognize in Metroidvanias, that's simply not all there is to it. There's more going on in both these genres that don't only impact how players will engage with the enemy, it impacts the design of the maps as well. And with that established, I want to say that Dark Souls isn't just a Metroidvania, it's the Metroidvania. All the game design concepts that evoke emotion that I talked about before are present here. The branching paths that mean players are making choices, the far apart save points that make players feel exhausted when finding this point of rest, hidden save points and illusionary walls that make exploration meaningful and rewarding. Its hands-off approach that makes discovery of the world overwhelmingly up to players, and the fact it's littered with strategically placed treasures. All of this encourages exploration. That is, exploration as a mechanic that both demands choices from players and is done in a way where players associate tangible risk with those choices. This is why it's important to understand that Dark Souls is a Metroidvania, because what it knowingly adds to the mechanics also adds to the already present emotion of the genre. For instance, Demon's Souls invented the precise combat that the series is known for, so much so it created the genre of Souls-like. This makes combat brutal, visceral, and extraordinarily high stakes, making it so there's a sense of desperation as we locate the next save point, and respite once we do. It added the mechanic of only getting one chance to recover your experience points if you die, thus making it so there's an escalated sense of tension that goes beyond just starting over again. It added the brilliant replenishable healing mechanic that makes save points that much more valuable, meaning players see this as an actual point of rest, rather than just an advancement in progress. It also made traveling back to a save point in the middle of a region a limited resource, thus making it feel like there's a forward pressure until you reach the next save point or beat the next boss. This is all stuff I'm thrilled to see other Metroidvanias adopting since Dark Souls' release, because it amplifies the emotion that's already present in the gameplay genre. Just about everything the game added seemed to be created in order to enhance that emotion that was already present in the gameplay genre, and it led to one of the most potent iterations of it. And remember, when a Metroidvania is able to understand the emotion it's communicating through the gameplay genre, it can take advantage of this to amplify the emotions you're meant to feel from the narrative genre. Dark Souls has a narrative genre of dark fantasy and the themes of a lone knight who's destined to rekindle a flame in a dying world. And all the emotions from the story it's telling about the player character, the loneliness and fatigue, the curiosity and drive to move forward, the exhaustion and respite, all of it is expertly communicated through the gameplay genre, just as it's communicated through the narrative genre. Because the emotion provided by the narrative genre of dark fantasy, where players control a character whose importance is infinitesimal in a land of gods, is present throughout the game. And the gameplay genres of Metroidvania and Souls games amplifies these emotions. Now players feel minuscule and impotent against the threats of this world through almost every interaction they have in the gameplay, and the resulting emotions are plentiful. And this, unfortunately, brings me to Elden Ring, a game that has the same narrative genre of dark fantasy and similar narrative themes of a lone knight who sets out to restore order to the land. But ultimately, its change in gameplay genre from Metroidvania to open world makes this emotion less potent, if present at all. Elden Ring is a phenomenal game, and I don't want to discount its genuine successes. It really should be the gold standard for what open world games are from here on out. And it made me realize that I really can like these games when they're not cluttering my HUD with task lists. The world has strong visual language that's largely good about piquing my interests. And when it was able to accomplish that, I discovered new content, a reward, or at the very least, an interesting fight. It was full of attractive landscapes that begged to be journeyed, and had the Souls combat we all love and expect from the developer. On top of that, you got your save points, you got your backtracking, your branching paths that lead to visually striking areas, and you even have your dungeons that are basically the traditional Souls experience with a much more linear design. What I'm trying to say is, for an open world game, this game often makes me feel much like I did with Dark Souls. And this isn't entirely surprising. After all, it's true open world games have a lot in common with Metroidvanias. In fact, before there was such a term as Metroidvania, and Koji Igarashi was coming up with the idea of Symphony of the Night, the game that's the reason Castlevania is portmanteaued into the genre title, his original idea was to make Zelda, but still Castlevania. And so I can understand why some might see Metroidvanias as equivalent to an open world game like this, including the creators of Elden Ring, who seem to think the next logical step for the series was Zelda, but still Dark Souls. But just like we saw with the Resident Evil comparison, game genres can appear to have a lot in common with each other, but still offer entirely different emotions. Because what comes with an open world game is an entirely different feeling from that of a Metroidvania. And as we're going to see, That's because the open world comes with its own set of mechanics, and those mechanics are going to make the risk component of exploration as a mechanic disappear. Let's start by comparing how we navigate each different map. Gone is the intricate labyrinth that connected all these disparate parts of the map, where players felt like they were embarking on a journey to a new niche part of the wilderness when setting out. Here they'd have to battle strange enemies that guard the path, all while paying careful attention for shortcuts, loopbacks, treasures, or bonfires to save their progress. But in Elden Ring, players have an overworld that, while beautiful and retains a lot of the three-dimensionality to the topography that Dark Souls has, players can largely skip it. They can blow by it on their horse, or they can sneak past enemies avoiding their patrol path. The game tries to compensate for this by making attractions more eye-catching, so players aren't just beelining past everything. And the trade-off is, we can now find some of these hidden areas, but we have to walk behind this slow asshole and think about what's missing in this shift. Because whether we notice it or not, this affects a lot about how we emotionally digest this game. For starters, there's no longer the risk that we accidentally find ourselves stuck beyond the limits of a progress gate, like we could if we weren't careful in Dark Souls, because the deeper players got into a region, the more the game was autosaving, meaning there was a ratchet effect constantly engaging no matter where players were. Now players had to either go deeper into the dungeon or claw their way out by reversing their path. While it's true players could use a homeward bone to teleport back to the last save point, players would eventually be confronted with a choice when they make it to the next save point. If players chose to rest at this bonfire, they would be stuck until they made their own way out. This feeling of anxiety and second-guessing your exploration choices is always present when players are making a choice when deciding what road they will go down. And after they have committed to a certain road, players will still be evaluating whether or not they can handle these enemies. Because the later they are when making that decision, the harder the game will be if they made a mistake. Because, again, the game will punish them for it. And even if the game doesn't really pull this trick where players get themselves stuck in the wrong neighborhood all that often, what matters is the game establishes that threat from the beginning of the game. Because this is what establishes the risk in players' choices. But this awareness of the risk is not so in Elden Ring. Players might stumble across a region like Caelid and decide they want to test their boundaries, but players never feel as though they might get stuck because the game systems clearly communicate to players that they can be exploited. The open areas combined with the fact that Torrent can run faster than enemies means players can control this entire region with little consequence. What's more is, because this is an open world game and players can warp between save points at any given time, there's no point of consideration on whether or not they will save the game, and that's because there are no negative consequences for that action. If anything, players are more eager to find a save point simply because they want to lose aggro or chart on the map where they got to in this forbidden region. And this changes the entire equation from what I was talking about in Dark Souls. That exploration that requires risk and choice evaporates, and that means so too does the emotion evaporate, because, well, this becomes completion rather than exploration. Players can now simply beeline it to the next save point if they decide they're in too deep, and they can warp back to an area they recognize once they do find that save point. And in fairness, Elden Ring tries to recreate this feeling that players are on a one-way street by making it so when players enter an optional dungeon, they can no longer warp out of it until they beat the boss. Trouble is, these optional areas are usually so small, the save point is at the entrance, and so all players have to do to exploit the game systems is walk out of the entrance that leads them out of the dungeon if they decide they're not ready for this particular challenge. And so there is no ratchet effect where players realize they're getting themselves deeper into a dungeon and they can feel that pressure. Players are simply adding options for what they can do to their itineraries, because once they're out of a dungeon, they can warp back in at any time. And this idea of the player taking advantage of the game's systems rather than tapping into their exploration instincts is a larger theme of why Elden Ring isn't as emotionally potent as it would be if it was a Metroidvania, because another aspect that the open world affects is how players decide to deal with the enemies of this world. Because in Souls games, I'd want to kill almost every enemy in my path. The downside of not doing this was having them chase me into an area where there was potentially a locked door, more enemies, or something else that would slow me down and cause me to succumb to the group. But in the big wide open overworld, there's very little need to fight most of these enemies. Sure, they might drop cool things, but not necessarily. And even if they're guarding something important, that doesn't mean players have to defeat them in order to get a reward. In fact, it's so easy to just yoink something in front of an enemy's face that it's practically incentivized. This is all to say that you can skip a surprising amount of this content, and the cost of which means we aren't really exploring anymore, at least not to the fullest extent of the definition. Players might be driven by their own choices here, but there's really not much risk that comes with those choices. And what's worse is players don't associate risk with those choices. It's a relationship of picking and choosing what you want to complete a la carte versus feeling a constant sense of self-doubt as you yearn for the next save point in your journey. And on the subject of save points, there's an entirely different relationship relationship between them and players in Elden Ring. In Dark Souls or many Metroidvanias, you don't see save points as a shortcut, only activated to come back to them once you unlock them. Instead, it was an oasis in a desert, a place of respite where you can rest after journeying through hell and barely making it. It wasn't always true, but when it was, it made for some of the most memorable moments in my gaming experience. And there's a formula in how that feeling is accomplished. The distance between save points, the difficulty of those enemies on the paths, the branching paths that will either lead you closer to a save point or take you further away from them, the paths that lead towards dead ends but have items at the end, all of this will factor into how stressful it is for a player before they feel that feeling of accomplishment and relief when seeing the familiar colors they now associate with rest. Altogether, it's exploration at its best, because it means players' choices are full of risk. But this exploration is not present in Elden Ring's overworld. Sure, the save points in Elden Ring are set up so they're just off the path that players will take, and sure, they allow us the chance to spend our experience and replenish our flasks. But with your ability to ride past enemies on this land, there really isn't that sense of risk and reward you get in a Metroidvania. And the difference again is in the emotion. Now save points in the overworld are just things you activate, not because you're craving that feeling of relief that comes with careful, stressful, and deliberate exploration, but rather you activate them so you have more options if you need to come back to an area via warping. And it's fair to point out that you'll eventually get the ability to warp in Dark Souls, but I think this misses the larger point I'm trying to make. There's a big difference between finding a save point on horseback and running over to activate it in case you need to access a nearby NPC later, and finding a save point that took everything out of you to reach it, and now you can rest and reap the rewards of your tenacity. Now, as many of you are probably furiously typing at me, it's of course true that save points in the dungeons act much in the same way as save points in Dark Souls, and that's to say exceptionally well for communicating emotion provided by the exploration. I felt a similar sense of relief when feeling I had nothing left to give even one more enemy, but instead of an enemy around the corner, I found a site of grace. It's a great feeling that I'm glad the game is occasionally able to capture, but unfortunately, this feeling wasn't complete, because as I've been saying, the open world comes with a new set of mechanics, and this new set of mechanics makes players feel like they're completing the game rather than exploring it. While the game retains many of the same combat mechanics, the game loses the forward pressure Dark Souls had because you can warp wherever you want at the touch of a button. Now players are just in a situation where if they fight an enemy beyond their skill or character level, they can simply warp to anywhere on the map they haven't yet done, reap the rewards of that area, only to just as effortlessly warp back to the most recent save point in the dungeon so they can try again, where they left off. Sure, players are making choices, but there's no risk associated with these choices, because if players decided they weren't ready for a particular challenge, they could simply scoop up their runes and try somewhere else. And players can distract themselves with all sorts of side stuff. That could be exploring one of the catacombs they haven't yet completed and getting those rewards, returning to a fort they haven't yet completed, fighting that boss at the Everjail, finishing that quest they didn't do yet, fighting that minor Erd tree they didn't beat yet, going back to the many caves they haven't completed yet. This isn't to say that Elden Ring is doing a bad thing by offering this many options that are only the result of the player's good eye, but the emotion it offers is completely different from what I'm describing in Dark Souls, and we need to be able to identify that. Gone is the feeling where we had to get good at a boss, or overcome the challenges of the region, or else be forced to fail somewhere else in the game that's of equal or greater challenge, and also in an entirely different section of the map, somewhere we'd have to take the time to walk there by foot with no guarantees that it would be any easier on us. Now we have a feeling we can pick and choose as we desire, where we go to extract slight advantages with relatively trivial challenge. And this really is the emotion, or lack thereof, I'm trying to identify, that comes with the open world game genre, when our exploration only comes as a result of us deciding there's probably something for us at the end of this cul-de-sac, but we'll only return if we decide we need some more runes to spend or a new trinket to equip. The game has ejected exploration as a mechanic from its formula. Maybe not entirely, but as far from what it was, where players felt every choice they made was coded in risk. After all, we're simply exploiting the game systems to take what we need when we need it, because we know what we're getting when we enter a catacomb, just as we roughly know what we're getting as we enter a cave, just as we know what we're getting when we fight a minor Erd tree. It's not always, but often, the same old thing. A boss at the end of the road who can either be defeated or not, and us deciding if we want to try somewhere else. And the result of this is, I just decided I would do these things as I wanted to do them, not because I was genuinely excited about seeing the world give way to my exploration. In the end, I could feel that difference. It's the difference that makes the world feel more like a theme park than a world that resists any decision we make. The price of admission for the spooky world's catacombs is finding the save point inside, and in order to be tall enough to ride Mr. Erdtree's wild ride is to have enough vitality so as to not get one-shotted. And if you change your mind, you can come back instantly when you're ready to, with no risk or penalty. It simply feels as though we're picking and choosing what we engage in for entertainment, just as we would at Disney World. And while it's entertaining, it's simply not all that emotional. I think one of the worst mistakes a critic can make is to assert something is bad, because it's not how they would have done it. The real goal of a critic should be to look at the goals of the work, and analyze whether it accomplished those goals and to what degree. And that's why I'm picking on Elden Ring at the moment. As I've said before, I love this game. It has hours upon hours of content that's fun, interesting, and rewarding. It has replayability where I genuinely can't wait to play all the different kinds of builds, something that's further encouraged by finding all the different items in the world that have nothing to do with my build, but look fun as hell to use. It has the combat I adore, and it has an awesome story supported by awesome lore. What's more is, it was so good at convincing players that their goals were their own, when in fact, there was a lot of audience manipulation going on. Something that's an infinitely superior system than a quest giver system that you'd see in almost any other open world game. In fact, it's so superior, it's almost an insult to compare the two, but here we are. There's so much here that's not just good, but great that I can't ignore or pretend like it has no value. But this doesn't change the fact that something's different here, and it's not a trivial thing. The emotion Dark Souls has is largely gone. All that we talked about that it added to Metroidvanias, from the strategically placed save points, to players feeling as though their choices will make or break them, to the intense combat, to the penalty for dying, ranges mostly or entirely undermined by the open world that simply doesn't synergize with the rest of these mechanics in the same way. And the additionally unfortunate thing is, it tells a story that would have benefited so much more from the gameplay genre the series helped perfect. A story about gods who struggled and fought over power, only to destroy the world in the process, and the player character that is only a knight who is now duty-bound to undo the chaos created by the gods.
And one other, whom grace would again bless. A tarnished of no renown, to stand before the Elden Ring and become the Elden Lord.
What better themes than these should the game make players feel through the gameplay? Self-doubt about their decisions, which are numerous, making them exhausted between save points as difficult enemies tax their limited resources and skills, through making them stressed that if they die, they risk losing much that they earned, as though they are at the mercy of the world that's hostile to them. Which is all to say, what Dark Souls benefited from in terms of emotion to tell its similar story, Elden Ring would have benefited from. And unfortunately, Elden Ring did not. Here, players largely took advantage of the game's systems that were meant to be taken advantage of. I'm under no illusions that what I'm saying here is going to influence FromSoft devs. I don't expect them to go back to their roots like Capcom did with Resident Evil 7, especially with how successful this game is compared to its predecessors, and the fact that with each Souls game, the mechanics seem to creep closer and closer to those of an open world game. And I'm not saying FromSoft even should listen to me. I love that so many new people were introduced to Souls games because of Elden Ring. The purpose of this video is to say that yes, the open world detracts from the overall experience, but what it detracts is something I'm not sure is all that well appreciated in the larger discourse, and that's the emotion the game is able to provide. And for that reason, I do feel the need to point this out for posterity. If not for FromSoft devs, at the very least, the Souls-like creators who are trying to understand what made Dark Souls as good as it was. What makes these games amazing isn't just the combat, or the exploration, or the Metroidvania genre, or the mythic story. It's how it all works together to create something more. And appreciating this fact really is at the core of what I'm getting at, to see other games take advantage of this idea of making the story and gameplay genres work together to create potent emotion. What I'm trying to say is, help us, Tagasmi-Sin, or however you pronounce your name. You are our only hope. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and ring my bell. I'm really excited about what I've currently got cooking, and if you're also interested in critical analysis on gameplay and storytelling like this, I think you'll love what's to come. So make sure you're getting my notifications. It's also content you can actively participate in supporting financially as well by becoming a patron, a group of people I sincerely cannot thank enough. They're the reason I feel like I'm able to push my boundaries, create better, more meaningful content, and offer original research. I'd also like to personally thank Griffin116, Grant Vogel, Faisal Shaker, John O'Donnell, James Burgett, Aaron Potter, Master Ren 7, Azala, Hans Homan, Rexai, Charlie Hustle, Simon, Uyuyu, Joshua Tokarski, Jeremy Barnes, Jan Berenz, Sergio Proxy, Percival, and Drawzer. Thank you all so much as always, and I'll see you all next time.